On this week's exciting episode, Perry and Della finally sleep together on a boat without ever taking their clothes off or ever touching, and without a shred of romantic intimacy. We'll have to settle for Whit Bissell lighting that flame. It's Season 1, Episode 11 of Perry Mason, The Case of the Crooked Candle. Welcome to the 11th episode of The Perry Pod. I'm your humble host, Jonathan Searcy, and my purpose here is pretty simple: provide an audio companion to the greatest legal drama in television history, Perry Mason. The goal is to do a pod for every episode of the television series, and, if time permits, to cover some of those made-for-TV movies too. I'll be working through the series in the order in which the episodes were aired. Each week, I'll give a brief refresher on the plot, and if the episode was based on a novel, I'll compare the book with its television adaptation. Next, I'll list some key pieces of trivia as well as tackle the episode's main theme. We'll feature a Perry proverb, a moment of wisdom from the man himself, and then we'll finish with a post-case water cooler, where just like Perry, Della, and Paul, we can rehash the ins and outs of their adventures. But first, to the law library! Each week in the law library, we return to prior episodes to refresh our memories about Perry's past, so we can find fresh precedents for future cases. This week, we note that we've got to be careful about Malvin Wald, the teleplay writer for episode 10, The Case of the Runaway Corpse. In last week's case, we see eventual murder victim Ed Davenport act as though he's been poisoned.
Hello? Hello?
Yes, sir.
This is Mr. Davenport in cabin 6. Who's the nearest doc around here?
Dr. Renault. He's just around the corner.
Well, get him over here right away. I'm sick.
Inside a hotel room with no one there to watch. And then be laid up in an oxygen tent even when no one is around but the crooked doc who's in on the scheme. When we later discovered that Davenport was faking the entire time, we might wonder why such a convincing show was put on for the camera alone. The simple answer? We're meant, as audience members, to be patsies every bit as much as Davenport's wife. Consider yourself warned. Now, to this week's episode. The Case of the Crooked Candle. The episode begins with a possible case of bigamy. Two women just want to get their hair done, but they realize they're married to the same man.
Mrs. Bradford?
Yes, I'm Miss Bradford. Well, there seem to be two of us.
Which Mrs. Bradford is next?
Mrs. Joseph Bradford.
Oh,
Then
that's
I'm
who-
next. Not that Bradford is such an unusual name, but...
Yes, it is curious, isn't it? Do you live in Beverly Hills?
Why, yes. On North Marquette Drive.
Really? This is... What address on North Marquette?
741.
You couldn't possibly...
One blonde, Rita, the other brunette, Martha. It's Martha who is both the actual wife and Perry's client. When we finally meet the husband in question, we wonder what both women were thinking.
Hold on just a minute. I'll see if he's still here. It's your wife.
I'm not here.
Sounds like she's crying.
Look, honey, I'm up to my ears in work. Can't you call back later?
Sure, he owns a land development business, but he's a gruff, harsh man who stands up his wife so he can complete a business deal. His chief associate, Jack Harper, looks on in disgust, but there's nothing he can do. Joe's smooth operator ethos doesn't just apply to the ladies, though. He's apparently swindled Greek stereotype George Nicolaitis out of a fortune.
Joe Bradford, you crazy or something?
No, I just want to see Mr. Bradford.
That Bradford. He come here. Nikolaitis shoot him. Dead.
Buying Nicolaitis' sheep grazing territory for a song when he's found out it's oil rich. The show pits three men who work with each other against one another. There's Joe Bradford, the husband, who disputes with Jack Harper, his associate, over the affections of his wife.
She's your wife, Joe.
That's right, Harper. She's my wife. And don't you ever forget it.
Harper thinks Bradford mistreats her, and he's grown fond of Martha, apparently talking things over with her, even before Bradford winds up dead. While she reciprocates Harper's affection, she says she will not pursue a divorce from Joe. Then there's Larry Sands, portrayed by Milquetoast personified Whit Bissell, who gets the unenviable role as fourth wheel.
Joe has his faults, but I'm sure bigamy isn't one of them.
I can dream, can I?
You always say the right thing, don't you?
He's an underling to both Bradford and Harper, never gets invited out to Bradford's boat.
I just came to get some of my gear.
Oh, yes, I forgot you were always the perennial weekend visitor.
Sore because you were never invited?
Look, Harper, don't let's waste time fighting.
And doesn't even have his own executive office. And apparently has to do actual location work. He's got a thing for Martha, and his calm advice gets her through a difficult evening when she meets the other Mrs. Bradford. Sands also recommends that she consult an attorney. Martha, of course, chooses Perry. And the story turns more ironic when Sands confesses to the murder, having killed Joe so he would have a better chance with Martha.
All right, Mr. Mason. I killed him. But I did it because I love Martha.
But just like at work, Harper's higher than him on the food chain, and Sands would have had to kill two men to actually get the woman he loves. This is the first Mason episode to feature a maritime murder. Mason must correctly interpret the laws of nature as much as the legal codes in order to crack the case. His key breakthrough comes from his lengthy cross-examination of nautical expert Captain Noble.
An expert on tides and navigation, Captain Noble?
Well, since I swore to tell the truth, I gotta admit I know more about these waters than anybody.
Through Noble, Mason establishes when the titular candle was lit, and after a morbid night with the fake corpse along with Della, Mason is able to figure out when the murder was committed. In catching Larry Sands, Mason uses the same method he applied to Mr. Burris in the case of the Angry Mourner. He notes that the details Sands gave when he testified would only have been known to the murderer. They didn't match any released version of the crime scene. When Sands tries to wiggle his way out of the crime earlier in the episode by falsely confessing to the crime, Berger had made mincemeat of this confession, and of course, Berger suspects Mason of foul play.
You were never anywhere near that boat. In the first place, Joseph Bradford was murdered about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, not 11 at night. And in the second place, the murder weapon was not a rock.
Well, I just made a mistake.
You made several mistakes.
But the true giveaway is that Sands' confession comes just after he finds out about Martha's affection for Jack Harper. Bissell, who is perfect in a role that calls for tortured blandness, gives his final confession with the requisite irony. He laughs when he should cry, knowing that he's committed the murder for no real gain. And as such, he is the perfectly self-aware Mason culprit. Unlike last week's episode, the 1944 novel version of Crooked Candle was considerably different from its television incarnation. If the novel is not Gardner's best, whole portions of it display Perry at his best. Unlike the show, which waits to introduce our intrepid attorney well into the action, the book starts in Mason's office. Unlike the TV Mason, the novel's attorney swings a pretty tough deal in civil cases. He's got a client whose car has been hit by a sheep fur truck, and Mason works hard to get the guilty party to cough up the cash. $100,000 in 1944 coin. He then handles a series of characters who have nothing directly to do with why he got involved with the car accident case in the first place. There's Carol Burbank and her father Roger. the land speculators who hope to set up an oil deal. They're the ones who end up as Mason's clients, not the wife of the deceased man. There's Fred Midfield and Henry Van Nuys. The latter is sort of a composite of Jack Harper and Larry Sands from the episode. There are two local land sharks who discover the oil and are buying up land for a song before the oil guys can get their mitts on it. There's Daphne Millfield, who is Fred's wandering wife. There's George Palermo, the giant Italian stereotype, not Greek, who got swindled by Millfield and Van Nuys. And then there's Mr. Cameron, not Captain Noble, who is the old salty seaman who knows his way around the water. Millfield ends up dead on Roger Burbank's boat. Carol, the daughter of the oil man Roger, gets accused of facilitating the crime while Roger gets charged with the murder. In a plot device very much in keeping with these early books, Mason has Della get involved with the case by having her accompany Carol to a new hotel as they try to avoid the police. When the police pick both of them up and peg Della for aiding and abetting a fugitive from justice, Perry has to stick with the case in order to make sure Della gets out of jail. Mason defends the Burbanks and eventually implicates Van Nuys for the crime, and Carol and Roger go free with Mason picking up a cool $100,000 for his original client, Adelaide Klingman. My favorite ruse in the book involves Mason's initial encounter with Carol Burbank. Afraid that her father will get charged with killing Millfield, Carol enlists Mason's help. The ruse she pulls in order to give her father an alibi is one every bit worthy of Mason himself, though Mason knows nothing about it. Tragg gets involved and eventually plans to accuse Carol of perjury for misleading him as to her father's whereabouts. Perry expertly busts Tragg's chops in court, showing how his sloppy detective work was based on inferences and implications rather than hard evidence. Part of the novel's appeal for me is that it teams Mason with a thinking woman who can match his gift for legal strategy. Plus, we get this awesome quotation about circumstantial evidence where Mason tells the judge and DA Hamilton Berger, quote, "Lots of lawyers don't like circumstantial evidence. I do. I've never had any quarrel with the evidence of circumstances. My quarrel is with the habit of giving events the obvious, careless interpretation. I dislike sloppy thinking." Put that on Mason's tombstone. I dislike sloppy thinking. Through a careful explanation of corroborating evidence, chiefly the titular candle, Mason shows that his client could not have committed the crime at the time proposed by Berger. What's especially interesting is that Roger Burbank, one of Mason's clients, gives every indication that he thinks he committed the crime when really he just knocked Millfield out. It was Van Nuys who completed the job. In the novel, therefore, Mason not only has to prove the client innocent to the jury, he has to prove the client innocent to himself. Now, let's get trivial, shall we? Each week in our trivia section, I give you 3 takeaways: a Paul, a Della, and a Perry. A Paul is a subject worth investigating more. A Della is something about a particular character in the story that we learn. And Perry is a fact we learn about our intrepid hero. Our Paul this week concerns the exterior of Joe Bradford's office building. Look closely at the nighttime shot of the building where Bradford does his work. It's Perry's office, which in reality was the Bank of California building. While we're not given any indication that the Bradford place of business is the same place Mason calls professional home, the mind reels at the possibilities. And for further research, find out places where other similar building exteriors are used and ask yourself, what other businesses exactly are in Mason's gigantic office building? Our Della this week concerns Paul Drake. He was as vociferous in his praise for Rita Bradford as he's been for any female he's crossed.
Here's a picture of her. Ran in the local society section just before the divorce.
Not bad.
That's the understatement of the year.
While Della, to whom he constantly refers As Beautiful shoots down Paul's advances, Rita seems open to the lanky detective's charm. Perry even costs up some cash to a tuxedo Drake for the occasion. Won't anyone learn? Marriage in 50s LA is a dangerous pastime. Watch out, Paul! Which brings us to this week's Perry. When Paul asks for something to fill his wallet, Perry pulls out 75 smackers.
Perry, I gotta make this fast. I forgot to cash a check. Could you let me have 50?
Why, sure.
You better make it 75.
For those of you keeping track at home, that's a cool $650 in 2018 buying power sitting in Perry's little defense attorney pocket. That's some dinner, Paul, and that's some pocket change, Perry. Somebody's not doing all their work pro bono. Our theme this week is black humor. Jack Harper calls his little routine where he sends Perry and Martha Bradford into the waiting gun barrels of Nicolaitis.
Why did you send us on that wild goose chase to Skinner Hills? Funny, Mr. Harper?
Only in a gruesome sort of way.
And Larry Sands ends the episode by calling his love for Martha while she loved Harper one of the funniest things ever.
I loved Martha and she loved Harper. you know, that's one of the funniest things ever.
Leonard Feinberg says that black humor is connected directly to nihilism. We laugh because the world is ultimately chaotic and values are meaningless. I will admit that the setup of the Mason world is potentially nihilistic. A judicial system that tries to find men and women guilty of crimes they did not commit. I think this is the dread behind Harper and Sands' jokes. What they're tapping into when they call a couple of different, obviously tragic situations funny. Notably then, Mason responds to Harper by refusing to laugh at the joke. And he looks away from Sands when he confesses his crime. On the other hand, with justice asserted and values clearly secure, Mason is a free man to crack a smile as he hands Drake 75 big ones to go out on the town with Rita Wassil. Our Perry proverb this week. Perry gets robbed of the opportunity to talk with his client after the acquittal, but we still get to hear what the topic of that talk would have been.
But she won't come in to see me. Too bad. I had a 30-minute lecture all prepared on the evils of lying to your lawyer.
I think that's what she was afraid of.
Perry's not here to judge. If I were him, I would be lecturing Martha about jumping out of the frying pan into the fire with another nihilistic businessman like Jack Harper. I've seen nothing that would show he's some great alternative to Joe Bradford. But Perry is worried about what he can control. He's responsible for the lies that his clients tell him, not the ones they tell others. Or, perhaps most importantly, the lies they tell themselves. You go, Perry. Now let's go to the water cooler.
There is one thing I don't understand. Go on, Paul.
A message from my mother and father, devoted listeners to the Perry Pod, about the case of the runaway corpse. Quote, there was no comment on the defendant's cousin, who unexplainably turned against her cousin, screened her calls in a very destructive way, and made wild accusations about her and the death of her uncle in front of Tragg. A most curious character. Also, if she packed the candy, when did she poison it? End quote. These are great questions. Thanks, Mom and Dad. I would note that the cousin is just as confounding in the novel as in the episode, so the teleplay writers were lifting the cousin from Gardner rather than making her up as they went along. What's most unsettling to me is that we get no closure. There's no meeting between Perry, the cousin, and the defendant after the trial to clear things up, or a meeting with just Perry and the client that would sort of imply that the cousin has been excised from the inner circle for betrayal. Instead, what we get is nothing. In reality, I think the cousin is part of the same stylistic technique that I highlighted in the law library that gives us Ed Davenport, quote, faking For real, because the camera's looking and the audience is thereby kept in suspense for a little while longer about what's actually going on. While we're busy trying to explain the cousin's erratic behavior, we're less likely to focus on the real murderer, Jason Beckmeyer. As for how the poison got in the candy, only Dr. Renault and Ed Davenport know for sure. Maybe they got some timely advice from Chocolates by Andre and that old Perry favorite Lola Flory. Go check out Case of the Silent Partner. I'd love feedback about this particular episode or the podcast in general. Was there something about this week's pod that you'd like to comment on? Something that you'd like to correct? You can leave comments on the pod's website at theperrypod.libsyn.com or email me at theperrypod@gmail.com. You'll find those links in the show notes. Thanks again for joining me on this pod journey. Join us next week when we get a cautionary tale from Paul. Don't brag that you can tolerate the hot salsa. That's next time on the Case of the Negligent Nymph. Until next time, this is Jonathan Searcy saying, keep on walking that Fifth Avenue beat.